15. Sheesh, it's hot. After some thought, I opened my menu window and unequipped my main armor, the Coat of Midnight. After another few seconds of consideration, I also returned my fortified breastplate to that storage. That left my only clothing, aside from my underwear, as black long-sleeved shirt and black pants. Both were tight-fitting, but the pants are made out of a fantastical material called shadow thread, which gave them substantial bonus to hiding and also a small amount of temperature regulation. I sighed and took a look around. My current location was in the middle of a narrow, dark path between the north wall of Loop de Grand Casino and the tall wall surrounding it. A heavy iron gate separated this path from the front garden of the casino, so it was clear that guests were not meant to come back here. But because SAO didn't have those invisible walls from classic 3D action RPGs, you could always cross any fence or wall, provided you had the strength or agility. And the game did not automatically turn you into an orange criminal for doing so. But NPC town guards were a different story. I didn't think they'd just attack me without warning, but after what happened at Tree Palace, it was quite possible I'd be apprehended, taken to jail, and held for questioning. On my left was the wall of the 4-story casino building, and on my right was the 10-foot wall. If I got trapped on both sides, front and rear, there would be no escape. Tonight was our plan to expose the wrongdoing of the Korloi family for Ninir, and tomorrow was our crucial mission to take back the sacred keys and restore Kismel's reputation. I couldn't afford to be arrested for even a single night. Should I turn back and play it safe? I wondered. But there was a vague worry deep in my gut that I'd been missing some crucial detail. We'd all but confirmed that the Korlois were dyeing the fur of a higher species of Lycan to pass it off as a rusty Lycan in the battle arena. Kyo, the maid, was mixing the decoloring agent at this very moment, and once sprinkled on the creature in view of the betting public, Korlois would have no excuse. In my head, I knew Ninir's plan was foolproof, but the gamer part of me always suspected a trap when things were going too smoothly. I'll just take a quick peek at the monster stables behind the casino, and if nothing sets off my intuition radar, I'll leave at once, I told myself, then resumed walking down the path. Fortunately, I reached the northwest corner of the building without encountering any guards, so I pressed my back against the white surface of the casino and listened closely. I could hear the faint sound of talking, but no one seemed to be coming closer. Leaning just barely around the corner, I took a quick peek. There was a space behind the casino, lined with stones, that was much more expansive than the front garden. 3 carriages, without any horse, were parked there. The doors of the rear of the carriage were made with iron bars that slid sideways, making it seem like these carriages were for transporting monsters captured in the wilderness. On the northern end of the space was a warehouse-like structure, but I heard the sound like whinnying now and then, which suggested it was a horse stable. I leaned out farther so I could look along the wall of the casino itself. There was a massive gate close enough to the carriage to pass through, with smaller doors on either side. Inside had to be the monster stables I was after. I'd assumed that would be a separate building, but they kept the space inside the casino. My initial plan was to sneak up and peek through the window, but that was now impossible. Sneaking inside would be much too dangerous, and yet one of those 2 small doors was half open, beckoning me closer. Fine, I'll go, I growled at the SAO game system, or just my own goddess of fate. Once again, I examined the whole space beyond the corner. From the horse stable, which was no more than 20 feet from my current hiding spot, I could hear the faint sounds of a mop being used and a voice singing a rather silly song. but there wasn't any other sign of humanity. My guess was that the capturing teams for the Nutch Toys and Corloys were still out doing their jobs. I steeled myself for the task ahead, rounded the corner, and rushed along the wall in a hunched position. I paused before the open door, listening for sound, then slipped inside once I was sure the coast was clear. The first thing I noticed was a faint, unpleasant odor. It reminded me of the zoo, a combination of straw, soil, and animal smell. The place was dark and spacious, not unlike a garage. The walls and floors were made of stone and had 2 large square holes on the back wall. Seeing this confused me at first, until I realized they were doorways for unloading monsters. Most likely, the carriages backed into the garage until they were flush with the holes. Then they slid the metal gates open so the monsters could pass through the holes on their own. Listening carefully, I felt like I could hear a low growling from behind the holes. I certainly didn't want to go in there, but I couldn't see any other... No, there. Plain gray doors on both the right and left walls. If I squinted, I could make out crests on the door, a red dragon on the left, and a black flower on the right, most likely a lily. Red dragon and black lily. One was probably the Corloy family crest, while the other presumably belonged to the Nutch Toys. I tried to remember the past day's events, but could not recall seeing the same symbols in either Ninir's room or the casino itself. If I sent a message to Asuna or Argo, they might be able to ask Ninir directly, but then I'd have to explain where I was and what I was doing, and if I was honest, they'd command me to call off my mission at once. Well, I told myself, what else do you do at a casino but rely on your hunches? But then I remembered the monster arena last night. The Corloy's rusty Lycaon and the Nutch Toy's bouncy Slater had appeared from different entrances into the cage, left and right. If the monster stables were separated into left and right areas farther within, then the side the Lycaon appeared from was the Corloy stable, and the one the Pillbug came from was the Nutch Toy stable. Playing back the visual memory of which was which, I had my answer. The Pillbug appeared from the left, and the Lycaon came out from the right. That meant the Corloy stable was the one I wanted to investigate. Was not the Black Lily door on the right. I was facing the stable from the opposite side as the arena last night, so the direction should be switched. That meant the Corloy door was the left one, with the red dragon. Sneaking closer, I reached for the knob, turned it, and pulled. It opened easily, so I waited for a moment, then snuck inside when I heard nothing. I quietly closed the door and turned around. Much like the cells beneath Herintry Palace, there was a gloomy corridor that extended to the left and right. But here, the floor, walls, and ceiling were hard stone. The doors were wooden, but reinforced with iron. There would be no burning through locks with a torch if I got caught and held here. I thought about equipping my sword from my inventory, but rejected the idea. I was the one trespassing here. If the guards spotted me, I didn't want to make things worse by getting violent. If spotted, I'd run away at top speed. And if I failed, then I failed. The hallway ended shortly to the left, so I followed it right instead. There were a few doors on the wall. I tried opening one of them, but it was just a dusty storage room, so I ignored the rest. On the wall at the end of the hallway was an open passage with no door. Beyond was a spiral staircase heading downward. I listened carefully, then quietly snuck down the stairs. The lantern-lit steps were natural stone that had been worn smooth with use. Speaking to the long history of the two families at the Colosseum, The temperature dropped as I descended, and the animal smell increased. Presumably, all the monsters in the battle arena were tamed through the hero Falhari secret technique that command monsters. But Nanir said their obedience didn't last indefinitely and unconditionally. So there was no guarantee that being in presence of an outsider like me wouldn't cause the monsters to go feral again. As I reached the bottom step of the stairs, I kept my senses as attuned to dangers as I possibly could, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. Beyond the arched doorway was another hallway, this one wider than upstairs. But lining the walls was a series of steel cages, not doors. I didn't see any humans in the hallway, but I could hear muffled voices in the distance. I listened as hard as I could, but I couldn't even tell how many people were speaking, much less the content of their conversation. Once again, I told myself, just gotta find out, and proceeded down the hall. After a few yards, I peered into the cage to the right and saw a squat animal lying on dirty straw. Something like a cross between a pig and a capybara. I recognized it as a giant pincer rat, a creature that lived near Lectio, the main town on this floor. It moved slowly and had no special attacks, but the pincer-like teeth that gave the rat its name were extremely powerful. If they bit down on your weapon, it was essentially impossible to pry it off. You'd have to beat the rat with another weapon, or get party members to help, or else it would break your weapon. Even a huge two-handed axe wouldn't withstand the pressure. But as long as you were aware of that, they were easy to defeat, so they'd been a big source of experience points in the beta. I'd beaten far more than just 50 or 100, but looking at it now in this setting, I felt pity for the creature. Don't be a hypocrite, I scolded myself, backing away from the bars and deciding not to peer into any other cages. I passed the second, through fourth, but as soon as I reached the fifth cage, my eyes found themselves automatically drawn to it. This cage was not bound with vertical bars like the others, but it was surrounded by a fine iron lattice pattern that ran vertically and horizontally. The gaps between the bars were barely an inch wide, suggesting that quite a small monster was being held inside. But once I saw the shadow huddled in the corner, I could see that it was no smaller than a capybara. Interested, I stared at it until its cursor appeared. The monster's name was Argent Serpent. I couldn't recall such a monster from the beta, but it was clearly a snake of some kind. Unfortunately, my mental dictionary did not contain the adjective that described it. In any case, the cage now made sense to me. A narrow serpent would be able to slip its way through the spaces that a larger mammal could not. Yet, the gaps between the bars in the actual arena within the casino were more than 3 or 4 inches. If they unleashed the snake there, wouldn't it slip through and threaten the guests watching the battle? Just then, an angry voice echoed through the corridor. "Damn it, behave!" I spun around on reflex, but there was no one around. Whatever the voice was yelling at, it wasn't me. Facing forward again, I could see a cage on the left and one on the right, and then a rather small doorway on the far wall, which did not seem to be a monster's chamber. If I focused, I could hear something like an animal growling from the back right cell. I snuck forward slowly, pressing myself against the wall, and peered carefully into the sixth cage. A little chamber was maybe 8 feet to a side, and 2 men stood inside, their backs to me. In the corner, resting atop a pittance of straw, was a dog-type monster with red fur. I didn't need to see the cursor to know it was a rusty lichen from yesterday. There were spots where the red color was coming off of its body, revealing white fur instead. The lichen bared its fangs at the men, growling softly. If that was a higher version of Lycan with its fur dyed, it would be dangerous enough that even the most advanced players would be wary of it. But these two were totally unconcerned, because the Lycan had a collar made of heavy iron that changed it to the wall. The men were solidly built themselves and wore deep red shirts, leather vests, and long gloves that went up to the elbow. Both of their cursors said handler of the Korloi family, meaning that their job was to deal with the monsters. The man on the right lifted a short whip and shouted, "Damn it, Mutt! Do what we say, or you'll get a taste of this!" The Lycan instantly backed down, further, but did not stop growling. The man on the left muttered with irritation, "We gotta paint this thing quick, otherwise it won't take to the fur by the match, and it'll still smell. It wasn't totally dry last night either." I noticed he had a large brush in one hand and a ceramic jar in the other. The brush was covered in red from the jar, the fur dye. Concentrating on the lingering smell, I picked up a sweet, sharp scent among the animal odor. It was definitely the same smell as the red stain we wiped off the bars of the arena. I didn't like it the first time, so it had to be overwhelming to a dog-type monster's sensitive nose. But the rusty Lycan, or whatever the proper species names it was supposedly under the control of Bardun Korloi, the power of employment. There was a food dish and a water bucket in the corner, so I assumed it hadn't lost its tamed status from hunger. So why was it continually baring its fangs at these handlers? Obviously, they couldn't have sensed my thoughts, but all the same, the man on the right scratched the back of his neck with the handle of his whip and grumbled, "We're gonna need Master Bardun to redo the trick on it." The burly shoulders of the man on the left bobbed up and down. "But the plan is to dispose of it today, right?" "Yeah, even those foolish nutch toys are bound to notice something's wrong by now. Once it's performed its last shift tonight, this doggy is going off to the farm." "So if we ask him to apply his trick again, he's just going to order us to make it last one more fight instead. It ain't cheap to do." "That's true." What did they mean when they said the technique to tame monsters wasn't cheap? According to Ninir and Kyo, it was a special power inherited from their ancestor, the hero Falhari. That sounded like an extra skill to me. Whatever it was, something wasn't adding up. The man with the whip clicked his tongue. "Fine, I'll whip it until it can't move anymore. Then you apply the dye. As long as we feed it healing potions throughout the afternoon, it should be ready for that last fight tonight." "All right, go ahead," said the man on the left, stepping back. The one on the right swung his arm back. The corded leather whip made a whistling sound and cracked firmly on the Lycan's back. The creature yelped and fell onto its side, red damage effect streaming from its back. It got up and resumed growling again. But just that one attack had taken its health bar from about 60% down to under half. The whip whistled through the air again. The Lycan tried to jump away, but the short chain jangled and held taut, keeping it within whip's range. It cracked against the Lycan's ribs, hurtling it backward and onto the ground again. Another 10% was gone from its HP, and it was now under a stun effect. For a third time, the man lifted his whip. "Stop!" I shouted before I even knew what I was doing. I clamped my mouth shut, but it was too late. "Huh? Who said that?" I pulled my head back just before they could spin around to see if I ran away now. But no, if they shouted, their companions were most likely to trap me on the spiral stairs. On a snap judgment, I opened my window and equipped the tattered burlap sack over my head. With a swoosh, the sack appeared and fit right over my head. There were no eye holes, but the fibers were woven so wide that I could actually see much better than I expected. The moment I closed my window, the door to the cell hurtled open, and the men leaped into the hallway. Their eyes went wide the moment they saw me standing there with the impromptu mask over my face. But they quickly recovered and shouted, "Who the hell are you? Are you with the Nut Toys?" The second accusation was perfectly accurate, but I wasn't going to admit it. Instead, I said nothing. The handler with the brush and jar, who also sported a perfectly villainous combination of a bald head and goatee, scowled and spat. "Whoever you are, we can't let you leave. Let's rough him up and toss him into the empty cells." "Sounds good. I've always wanted to try hitting a person with this thing," said the other handler, smacking the whip against the ground. That was the signal to turn their color cursors from yellow to red. But the shade of red was quite pale. That meant their level was far below mine. However, not only was it the first time I'd fought a person using a whip, I was also the trespasser here. Just because fighting them wouldn't turn me orange didn't mean I could just kill them. Perhaps I could neutralize them without taking too much HP, so I could escape the place before the real guards rushed in. The whip master had no beard, but his hair was long and his brows were thick and angled with fury and concentration as he pulled his arm back. While it was my first time fighting against a whip, I'd seen its ideal range and attack timing after watching him punish the Lycaon. By the time the whistle echoed off the walls, I was already charging forward. The weapon came from the upper left, which I ducked to avoid, the enlarged tip brushing atop of my head as I rushed past. I held my left fist at waist height, then thrust it forward. The glowing red fist struck the whip handler right between his impressive eyebrows. That was the basic martial arts skill, Flash Blow. Not so powerful, but with a much higher chance of inflicting a stun on a clean hit than a slashing sword did. As I hoped, the whip handler flew off his feet and splayed out on the ground motionless. Over 70% of his HP was left. But there was a yellow ring of light rotating around his head. That was the stun effect I wanted. And not the weakest kind that wore off in just 3 seconds, but a powerful stun that would immobilize him for nearly a minute. It didn't work that well against players, but it seemed to me that ordinary NPCs who weren't soldiers or warriors were more likely to fall victim to negative status effects. "Whoa!" The other handler gasped with shock, then sucked in a deep breath. He was going to shout for the guards. I leaped forward again, determined to stop him. This time, I threw a flash blow with my right fist directly into his temple. The handler left his feet, smacked the back of his head against the metal bars of the cell, then fell to the floor, covered with visual effects indicating damage and stunned effect. The jar came loose from his hand and fell. I caught it just before it could smash noisily against the floor. Just as I'd hoped, I was able to neutralize my adversaries without killing them. But at best, they were only going to be stunned for another 50 seconds. I had to escape Corloy's stable and return to the front of the casino within that span. I was just pivoting around on the ball of my foot when I caught sight of the rusty Lycaon, lying limply on its side in the back of the cell. On pure instinct, I tensed my foot, then tried to run again, but my avatar would not obey me. What would those handlers do to the Lycaon if I ran out on it now? They'd assume that their fur dyeing scheme had been leaked to the Notch Toys and eliminate their evidence sooner. Even still, so what? It was going to be destroyed later tonight anyway, so it was just a difference in timing. And the Lycaon wasn't someone's beloved pet. It was just a monster, like the lancer beetles and poison wasps and hematolomaby we'd already killed on this floor. A simple mob, the likes of which I wouldn't hesitate to fight with my sword in the wilderness. All of these facts I knew perfectly well. And yet, damn it, I leapt through the open door into the cell. The prone beast craned its neck and growled, but its voice was weak and unintimidating. The yellow cursor that showed its HP bar was only at a third full. I opened my window and tossed the jar into my inventory, then hit the quick change button to unequip my sword. Once I'd drawn it from my back, I took one swing and severed the chain that connected the Lycan's collar to the wall. The Lycan barked, feeling the vibration of the blow. I quickly put my sword away and whispered to the injured beast, "Just stay calm." I couldn't tell if that growl was a yes or a no, but the cursor was still yellow, so at the very least, it wasn't targeting me for attacks. I approached it carefully and put my arms around the creature, which was the size of a German shepherd. Lifting it up, its frame was sturdy, but because of my strength stat, it didn't feel very heavy to me. Grrr! The Lycan barked, struggling a bit before giving up and hanging its head. It hadn't accepted my control, it just didn't have the strength left to fight me. Out in the field, monsters would battle out to the very last pixel of health. It should have been true for this Lycan too, so why couldn't it move? Maybe it was inflicted with some kind of negative status. But I could figure that out later. At this moment, I had to get out of the underground stable. I leaped out of the little cell holding the Lycan. The handlers were still stunned, but the yellow visual effect encircling their heads was much fainter than before. They'd probably be up and moving in less than 20 seconds. At full speed, I dashed down the hall, using the loose weave of the burlap for visibility. In less than 3 seconds, I was through into the corridor without slowing. Within 5 steps, I was past the curving wall, into the stairwell, where I bounced up 3 steps at a time. At last, I could hear their shouts behind me. But the building wasn't built with security against intruders in mind. I didn't hear any alarms or trumpets or bells. It was going to take longer for the guards to hear from the handlers. Once I was on the ground floor again, I hustled through the short hallway into the loading garage. Fortunately, it was still empty in here, though I was sure the open yard at the back would not be the same. I stopped briefly in front of the door I used to get inside, peering out carefully. As I suspected, in the middle of the loading yard, the 2 employees had finished cleaning the horse stables and were in conversation with 2 fully armed guards. If a stranger, wearing a sack over his head, tried to leave now carrying a Lycan, it was going to cause an uproar, and it was another 20 seconds. The handlers from below were going to be up here. Perhaps I had something that might help me in my inventory, but there was no time to go scrolling through the huge list. My inventory! My eyes bulged. I slipped the Lycan under my left arm and opened my window with my free hand. At the top of my inventory, which was ordered from most recently picked up, was an item called Rubrarium Flower Dye. I tapped the name and it materialized it, grabbing the jar and pulling back as far as I could. I could really use the throwing knife skill right about now, but this distance should be close enough. Please hit them, I prayed, hurtling the jar at full strength through the half-open door. The jar flew straight and smacked off the sturdy breastplate of the guard facing this direction. It burst, spraying the red liquid like mortar. Instantly, all 4 of the faces in conversation were splattered with the same color of the Lycan's fur. Ugh! What is this? My eyes! My eyes! The instant the men hunched over, hands over their faces, I bolted out into the courtyard. At that very moment, voices behind me wailed, "Guards! Guards! There's an intruder!" But the guards and stable hands were preoccupied. I rushed past the 4 of them, and rather than using the side path I took around the casino building, I headed for the double gates at the back of the rear yard. Obviously, I couldn't go running past armed guards on either side of the gate. Their eyes bulged within their helmets. What? Where did you? But while they wasted time talking, I was already upright and running. The stone wall that surrounded the rear of the casino was also the wall of Volupta itself. A graphic reading out of town appeared before my eyes and vanished. I could hear the howls and the handlers behind me, but they rapidly dwindled. Up ahead was grassland in blazing midsummer sun, as well as an unpaved path scarred in with countless wagon wheel marks. It curved ahead to the right, and would surely lead back to the road that went through the west gate of Volupta, which I'd passed through with the rest of my group just hours earlier. But I couldn't just run into town with the monster, and on the open road, I was visible to anyone who came chasing me. I looked over my shoulder as I ran and saw the 2 armed guards and the handlers starting to run after me. I'd gotten a lead of at least 100 feet on them, but I was also carrying a creature the size of a large dog, so I wasn't sure I could outrun them on flat, open ground. I needed to break their line of sight to escape. As soon as I faced forward again, I remembered something. If I continued straight where the path curved, I would reach the riverbed where we searched for the Wurtstones earlier, less than 500 yards ahead. On the other side of the river were patches of the overgrowth that would be a perfect place to hide. Hang on a bit longer, I urged the exhausted Lycaon, shifting my feet into higher gear. I was running like a ninja, keeping my body at an incline as far forward as I could, and keeping my stride as even as possible. The shouts grew quieter in the distance, but if I got too desperate in my escape, I could trip and lose my balance. I focused on the ground ahead, evading any stones hidden in the grass or dead branches. After reaching the top of a gentle hill, the green bush patches came into view, framing the silver gleam of the water between them. That was the largest river on the 7th floor, starting from the mountains in the north, flowing across the plains into the sea of the south. I was curious where so much water actually went once it reached that small sliver of a sea, but that was not a mystery to wonder about at this moment. There was a spot, about 5 or 6 bushes clumped together, that I eyed as I hurtled down the hill. The game tended to generate denser bushes near trees, and that would offer me an adequate hiding space. The only question was if I'd get into position before my pursuers reached the top of the hill and saw me. I practically toppled down the last 100 yards of the slope. I felt like the game was rolling whether or not I fell with every step. I could only trust my stats and true luck. My focus was on the edge of the rapidly approaching brush, and once I was just 15 feet away, I leaned backward and slid on my back, holding the Lycaon tight with both arms as my foot led away into the massive leaves. Nearly all the trees and bushes in SAO could be lumbered, i.e. destroyed, but some trees had a basic core that was indestructible. If the system had designated this particular bush as one of those impenetrable walls, I might just bounce off. Fortunately, the bush merely sprayed loose leaves as it welcomed me inside. Even luckier, the interior was kind of hollow, surrounded by several bushes, making it a good hiding spot. I ripped off the burlap sack I'd been wearing this whole time and peered through the branches at the slope I'd just run down. After about 5 seconds, my pursuers appeared at the top. The 2 guards and 2 handlers looked around, searching for any sight of me. If they were players or advanced AIs, they'd probably realize I was hiding in a brush, but these ones had typically NPC or monster pursuit algorithms. 4 men stared all over the open field, and their faces swept over my hiding spot several times, but they weren't coming down the hill. Eventually, they stopped searching and traded a few words. Immediately after, their red cursors turned back to yellow. After they had turned around and descended the hill towards the town, I finally let air escape from my lungs. That was when I recalled, at last, that I was still holding the rusty Lycan. The Lycan rested its head on my arm and panted rapidly. I checked its HP bar quickly and saw that the remainder was under 20% and decreasing slowly but surely. Maybe the handler's whip had poison on it, but then there shouldn't have been a debuff icon, and there was no reason for them to weaken the monster that was supposed to fight in the match for them. This meant the DOT, damage over time effect, was from some other hidden kind of negative status effect. And in most cases, such things were hidden because they were part of a quest, which meant... "It's the die!" I snarled, sitting upright. Minutes earlier, I'd escaped by throwing the rubarium die at the guards. I was hoping to just confuse them for a few seconds, but the NPC had collapsed and clawed at their eyes. That suggested that the dye was poisonous and would probably cause continual damage if it went into your eyes or a wound. Meaning that the Lycan was losing HP because it was struck with a whip while the dye was thick on its fur. Maybe I could take it over to the river and wash out the dye? But no. If simple water could wash out the dye, Ninir wouldn't have bothered to make a bleaching agent. If I couldn't get the dye out, then if I healed of its wounds, recovered its HP, the damage should stop. I quickly opened my inventory, grabbed the burlap sack I dropped, then materialized a healing potion, which I opened and held out to the Lycan's mouth. "Here, drink this." But the Lycan just panted, its tongue lolling out of its mouth. It did not try to drink. I tried dripping some of the red liquid onto its tongue, but it just dripped off onto the ground. In an older MMORPG I'd played before, healing a tamed monster's HP required the appropriate skill, so perhaps it worked that way in SAO 2. That would mean I had no way to heal the Lycan now. A healing crystal might do the job, but the only crystal we'd found on this floor was in Asana's possession, and I didn't want to use what could be our lifeline on a monster. It was a sudden impulse that led me to save the Lycan and escape. Was that gesture pointless? No. I would also be eliminating a chance to reveal the Corloy's family's wrongdoings. So it wasn't just pointless, it was a setback. How could I apologize to Argo, who took on the quest? Ninir and Kyo, the clients for the quest, and Asana, who worked so hard to help gather the materials for the decolorant. "Ah!" I gasped. There was perhaps one way to save the Lycan. The chance of it actually coming to be was low, but if I gave up now, I'd never forgive myself. I went back to my open player window and wrote a quick message to another player. Then I cradled and stroked the dying Lycan's neck until a response arrived 2 minutes later. I gave it a quick read and exhaled. Then put the potion back into my inventory and pulled out a leather water skin instead. "You might not like the potion, but I bet you drink water." I poured out some liquid into my palm and held it up to the beast's mouth. The Lycan lifted its head a tiny bit and lapped at the water. Of course, that alone wasn't going to heal its HP nor stop the damage. At the very least, I wanted to take off the iron collar with the dangling chain, but it was fastened very tight, and I couldn't loosen the nut with my fingers. Instead, I let the Lycan's head rest on my lap, and I waited patiently.